The council voted to expel Earth. Moments later, humanity declared their own terms. I had 3 minutes left on my speaking clock when Archon Vel raised his hand and called for the vote. Not at the end of my speech, not after I had finished, 3 minutes before. The chamber did not protest. 900 delegates from 14 species sat in their curved tiers, wrapped in robes and exoskeletal armor and bioluminescent skin that pulsed soft colors when they were comfortable. They were very comfortable. They watched me the way you watch a door close, not with interest, not with cruelty, just with the casual patience of people who already know what comes next. I lowered my notes. My name is Yael Mori. I am 44 years old. I was born in Bristol, England, on a Tuesday, during a rainstorm that flooded the lower streets for 6 days. My mother worked in a shipping logistics firm. My father taught secondary school mathematics. Neither of them ever imagined their daughter would one day stand in a hall carved from a living moon, orbiting a star 40 light-years from Earth, defending the right of 8 billion human beings to exist within galactic civilization. I had spent 19 years building toward this moment, not this specific moment, not the vote, not the expulsion, not the quiet catastrophe of watching Archon Vel's long fingers curl in that slow, practiced gesture that meant the discussion is over, but the larger moment, the one where I would finally say something that mattered, where the words I had spent 2 decades sharpening would find their mark. Instead, I watched the vote counter appear above the chamber floor, suspended in light, and I understood that no words I had were going to stop what was already in motion. Let me tell you how we got here. Earth joined the Galactic Council 41 years ago, 3 years before I was born. The joining was not celebrated the way our entertainment media had always imagined first contact would be. There were no great ships descending through clouds, no exchange of gifts, no moment of wonder shared between species who had finally found each other across the dark. What happened was simpler and considerably more humiliating. A Serenthi survey vessel detected our radio emissions and filed a report. The report circulated among council members for 11 years without any action being taken. Then a Duvari trade expedition passed through our outer system, noticed we had developed a crude form of faster-than-light travel, based on a principle the council had abandoned 300 years earlier, and decided we might be useful. The Duvari petitioned for human provisional membership. The council agreed, not because they wanted us, but because the Duvari wanted us, and the Duvari were worth keeping happy. We were given a seat in the chamber. It was the smallest seat. This was not symbolic. The chair was physically smaller than every other chair in the hall, because no one had bothered to measure a human being before ordering the furniture. I sat in that chair for 19 years. I put a cushion on it after the first month. No one ever commented on the cushion. I think they never noticed it, which is perhaps the most accurate summary of humanity's position in the council that I could offer you. Provisional members could speak but not vote. We could propose but not ratify. We could object but could be overruled without discussion. We paid a membership contribution equivalent to 12% of Earth's annual scientific output, in the form of research data, medical formulations, and engineering schematics. And in return, we received access to galactic trade routes, protection under the Council's Mutual Defense Treaty, and the right to attend meetings where decisions were made about us without our input. For 19 years, I attended those meetings. I learned to read the color shifts in Serenthi's skin. I learned which Kel Syndicate delegates would actually listen if you caught them before the session started. I learned that the Molthari representatives always voted with whoever had given them the most favorable agricultural import terms in the previous quarter, and I learned to make sure that was us whenever it mattered. I built relationships. I called in favors. I drafted 3 separate proposals for full council membership, 2 of which were voted down without debate, and 1 of which was simply never scheduled for discussion. I understood, in the way you understand things that you do not want to be true, that the council did not want us as members. They wanted us as contributors. There is a difference, and it is a difference that matters enormously. What changed everything was the Veth. The Veth Dominion was not a council member. They operated along the outer rim of mapped space, a militarized civilization of roughly 2 billion individuals who had never applied for membership and had made clear they never intended to. They had been in a slow territorial dispute with the council for decades, nothing that ever resolved into open conflict, just a long, grinding competition over resource-rich systems near the edge of the mapped region. Earth had 3 mining installations in that region. We had been there for 9 years, longer than the Veth had been interested in the area. When a Veth patrol vessel ordered our installation crews to evacuate, our crews declined. They declined politely, they declined with documentation of prior claim, and they declined while broadcasting on every available frequency so there would be a clear record. The Veth vessel opened fire. No one was killed, because our installation shields were considerably stronger than the Veth expected, and because our security personnel responded with a precision and speed that clearly surprised the patrol crew. The Veth vessel retreated. Our installations remained intact. The Council's response to this was not to support us. Their response was to hold an emergency session, at which 14 species discussed whether humanity's presence in the Outer Rim was itself a destabilizing factor. I was invited to attend but not to speak. I sat in my small chair, my cushioned, ridiculous, small chair, and I listened to 9 hours of debate about whether we had provoked the attack by simply existing in a region we had legally occupied for nearly a decade. At the end of that session, Archon Vel stood and announced that a formal motion had been filed. The motion called for the expulsion of Earth from the Galactic Council, on the grounds that humanity represented, and I am quoting from memory, a pattern of escalatory presence, incompatible with the maintenance of Council stability. I did not visibly react. I had learned, over 19 years, that the most unsettling thing you could do in that chamber was remain completely still when everyone expected you to flinch. I sent one message. It went to one person. The encryption was military grade, routed through 4 relay stations, and disguised as a routine data packet inside a larger trade transmission. The message was 7 words. They are going to vote us out. The reply came back in 40 minutes. It was 4 words. Fleet is already moving. I want to be honest with you about something. When I read those 4 words, sitting alone in the small office they had assigned to the Earth delegation, a room with one window that faced an interior corridor, rather than the stars, because even our view had been an afterthought, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time. I felt calm. Not the brittle calm of someone holding themselves together. Not the controlled calm of a diplomat maintaining composure under pressure. The deep, settled calm of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment for many years, and has just been told that the moment has arrived, and that everything is in place. I finished my tea. I reviewed my notes for the following morning's session. I adjusted the cushion on my chair and thought about my mother, who had worked in shipping logistics, and my father, who had taught mathematics, and about the particular kind of patient, practical intelligence that seemed to run in my family, and that I had, perhaps, taken in a slightly unusual direction. Then I went to bed and slept for 7 hours. The vote was scheduled for the following morning, and I intended to be very awake for it. The chamber filled at the normal hour. I arrived early, as I always did, and I sat in my small chair, and I watched the other delegates settle into their places. The Serenthi clustered together in their silver section, their skins cycling through soft blues that indicated something between anticipation and satisfaction. The Kel Syndicate's 4 representatives sat perfectly still, as they always did, their mechanical augmentations making it impossible to tell whether they were paying attention or running internal calculations, which were, for them, the same thing. Archon Vel took his position at the central podium. He was tall, even by Serenthi standards, and he wore the ceremonial layered robes that indicated a formal proceeding rather than a working session. He had dressed up for this. He wanted it to feel like an occasion. He gave me 4 minutes to speak. I took all 4 of them. I spoke clearly and without drama. I reminded the chamber of the 41 years of contributions Earth had made. I cited specific figures for the medical research we had shared, research that had extended the average lifespan of 3 council species by measurable years. I cited the engineering protocols we had developed that now underpinned 60% of the council's inner system transit infrastructure. I cited the diplomatic resolutions we had helped broker, the conflicts we had helped prevent, the 17 separate occasions on which human personnel had participated in council defense operations and performed without a single incident of misconduct. I did not beg. I did not apologize. I made the case clearly, and I made it well, and when the 4 minutes ended, I stopped speaking and I sat down. The vote proceeded. 9 in favor of expulsion, 1 against. Mine, which was non-binding. The light counter above the chamber floor confirmed the result in 4 languages simultaneously. Archon Vel looked at me across the chamber. He smiled. It was a careful, deliberate smile, the kind that is not really an expression of feeling but a communication of outcome. He was telling me that this was finished. He walked to where I sat and he gestured toward the chamber doors. The gesture was polite. It was also unmistakable. I stood. I gathered my notes. I picked up my cushion, and this part I want you to understand, because it matters. I picked up my cushion from the small chair, and I tucked it under my arm, like I was carrying something I fully intended to use again somewhere else. Archon Vel watched me do this. He said nothing. I walked past him toward the doors. I did not look back. There was no reason to. Everything I needed to see was 40 light-years away, and moving at speeds that the Council had not yet had occasion to measure. 72 hours, the official notice said. We had 72 hours to vacate our representation, recall our attachés, and formally acknowledge our removal. 41 hours of that window remained. I took the transit corridor to the diplomatic docking bay, boarded the small Earth shuttle that had been waiting there for 3 days with its engines idling in standby mode, and I told the pilot to take us out to the edge of the system. The pilot, a young man named Gary Cole who had been flying Council transit routes for 6 years, and who had never once been told why we always kept the engines in standby rather than powering fully down, looked at me once in the rearview display. Edge of the system? He said. Edge of the system, I said, and then stop. I want us to have a clear line of sight. Gary did not ask what we would be looking at. He had been around long enough to understand that when the ambassador stopped talking, it was time to start flying. We cleared the docking bay and began the transit out through Selenarch Prime's orbital lanes, past the great curve of the Council's administrative stations, past the docked vessels of 14 species, past the outer platforms where resource shipments were processed and logged, and fed into the economic machinery that kept galactic civilization moving. I looked out the viewport at all of it. I thought about a small chair. I thought about a cushion. I thought about 19 years of being useful and dismissed simultaneously. Then I thought about those 4 words, and I watched the stars, and I waited. The stars at the edge of Selenarch Prime's system are different from the ones near Earth. They look colder somehow, even though light does not have temperature. It is something about the density of the star field out here, the way the distant galaxy arm curves differently, the particular shade of dark between the points of light. I had spent a lot of time looking at stars in 19 years. I had become something of an unintentional expert on the way they looked from different coordinates. Gary Cole had parked us at a clean stop point, just past the 6th orbital marker, exactly where I had asked. The engines ran in quiet maintenance mode. The shuttle interior was warm and smelled like recycled air and the faint chemical residue of Gary's protein bar, which he had eaten approximately 20 minutes ago, and which I had politely declined when he offered half. I was not hungry. I was, however, precisely calibrated for the next 12 hours, in a way that made food feel irrelevant. "Do you want me to run the long-range display?" Gary asked. "Please." The forward viewport expanded its overlay, a transparent grid of system data, vessel positions, the slow orbital drift of the Council's outer platforms, everything in its ordinary place. Everything running on the routine that had governed this system for 240 years of Council administration. I watched the display. I drank my second tea of the morning. Then the display changed. It did not change the way things usually change in space, gradually, with the slow accumulation of movement over time. It changed the way a held breath releases. One moment the long-range grid showed the familiar pattern of a settled, stable system. The next moment it showed 14 new contacts appearing at the edge of sensor range, and then 3 more, and then the display struggled briefly with the update because it had not been calibrated to process that many simultaneous FTL arrivals. Gary sat forward. He was 29 years old and had an excellent professional composure, but he sat forward. "Ambassador," he said. "I see them," I said. 14 warships came out of faster-than-light transit in a formation so clean and precise that it looked like a rehearsed display rather than a military deployment. They arrived in a flat horizontal line across the system's ecliptic plane, not aggressive, not encircling, just present, undeniably, clearly, unmistakably present, and then the carrier platforms dropped in behind them. I had known, in an abstract sense, that the United Government Defense Fleet had been growing for 3 decades. I had known this the way you know something that exists in a category marked classified, the way you know a number without having seen it written down. I knew the budget allocations. I knew the construction schedules that appeared in the reports I was permitted to read, and I knew roughly what the reports I was not permitted to read were likely to contain. Knowing it and seeing it were, it turned out, completely different experiences. The 2 carrier platforms were each larger than the Council's primary administrative station. They were not sleek or beautiful in the way that the Serenthi designed their vessels. The Serenthi had an architectural philosophy that treated every ship as a form of art. The UGDF carrier platforms were functional, dense, and quietly enormous. They sat in the dark of the outer system like 2 pieces of something very ancient and very serious. And behind them, running without its exterior lighting panels active, came the ship I had been waiting for. The UGDF flagship ran completely dark in that first moment. No beacon, no transponder broadcast, no running lights. Just the negative space of something very large blocking the stars behind it. Then, precisely on schedule, the exterior panels activated, and the ship announced itself to every sensor in the Selenarch system with the clean, factual clarity of something that had never needed to hide and had chosen, for reasons of its own, to arrive quietly. The ship was called the Indomitable. I had met Admiral Dara Osei twice in my life. Once at a function in Nairobi where I was representing the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and she was receiving a commendation I was not cleared to know the full details of. Once in a brief video conference 6 years ago, arranged through secure military channels, during which she had said very little, and I had said exactly what I needed to say, and we had understood each other completely. She was now broadcasting on the system-wide emergency channel, not encrypted, not restricted, not formatted for any particular recipient, open to every vessel, every station, every delegate's personal receiver, every Serenthi skin sensor array that might be picking up the signal. Her voice was even, not dramatic, not raised, the voice of someone reading a prepared statement they believe in the same way a person reads coordinates, clearly, accurately, without embellishment. This is Admiral Dara Osei, commanding the United Government Defense Fleet. We are transmitting from the outer orbital region of the Selenarch primary system. We are not here in a hostile capacity. We have not engaged any weapon systems. We are here to deliver a formal communication on behalf of the people of Earth. I watched the long-range display. The Council's defense platforms had activated. I could see the sensor bloom that indicated their targeting systems coming online. 3 Council patrol vessels had moved to intercept heading, which meant they were pointing in the fleet's direction without actually closing the distance, which was precisely the response of people who understood they were looking at something they could not successfully engage, and were going through the procedural motions anyway. The Indomitable did not move. None of the 14 warships moved. The carrier platforms sat exactly where they had arrived. The formation held steady, and the stillness of it was more eloquent than any maneuver could have been. Archon Vel's voice came onto the channel 12 seconds after Osei's broadcast ended. His translation matrix was operating. I could hear the slight processing delay that came with real-time cross-species language conversion. "This is an unprovoked military intrusion into Council sovereign space," he said. "You will withdraw your vessels immediately, or face the full response of the Council's combined defense coalition." There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Osei said, "We have received the Council's decision regarding Earth's membership status. We are here to deliver Earth's response. If you would like to hear it, we are transmitting now. If you do not wish to hear it, the transmission will still occur. We simply wanted to extend the courtesy of notifying you." And then she began to read. I had read the document myself, 3 days ago, in a session with Earth's legal directorate that had lasted 14 hours, and had involved 7 separate departments, and 1 retired judge from Cape Town named Henry Adkins, who had been brought in specifically because of his expertise in the legal architecture of international declarations, which was, everyone agreed, the closest human precedent for what they were writing. I had read it. I had contributed to it, in small ways. I had suggested 3 phrases and had one of my suggestions accepted, and 2 of them revised into something better. But hearing it read aloud, in Dara Osei's measured voice, broadcast across the entire Selenarch system while 14 warships sat at the edge of sensor range, and every council species in that chamber, and on those stations listened whether they wanted to or not. That was different. That was the thing itself becoming real. It was called the Declaration of Human Sovereignty and Independent Terms. It began, and I am recalling this as exactly as I can, with the following. The people of Earth, through their elected government and authorized military and diplomatic representatives, hereby declare that the decision of the Galactic Council regarding Earth's provisional membership is acknowledged, is recorded, and is rejected, not as an act of aggression, not as a demand for reversal. It is rejected because it is irrelevant. Earth's standing in this galaxy is not contingent on the Council's permission, has never been contingent on the Council's permission, and will not be contingent on the Council's permission going forward. Gary Cole had stopped doing anything else. He was simply listening, his hands in his lap, his eyes on the display. The declaration continued for 47 minutes. It detailed the establishment of a new interstellar body, the Human Compact. Structured, legal, with a formal charter that had been drafted over 3 years by a working group that included legal scholars, economists, military strategists, diplomatic experts, and representatives from 11 other species who had been consulted in private, and who had, it turned out, been waiting for exactly this kind of invitation. The compact was not a replacement for the Council. The declaration was very precise about this. The compact was a parallel structure, operating under its own laws, governing its own space, and managing its own relationships with whoever chose to engage with it. Any species wishing to trade with human territories would negotiate directly with the compact. The Council's tariff structures, import restrictions, and trade licensing frameworks would have no authority in compact-aligned space. Any existing trade agreements between Earth and Council member species were being formally reclassified as bilateral agreements between Earth and those individual species, independent of Council oversight. The Compact's defense doctrine made clear that human space would be defended by human forces, without reference to the Council's defense coalition, and that the UGDF's rules of engagement were now governed by Compact Charter, rather than Council Treaty. And then came the clause that I had suggested, in its revised form, which was better than what I had originally written. It stated that any species currently under Council membership that had experienced sanctions, trade restrictions, forced renegotiation of terms, or any other form of political pressure from the Council's majority bloc within the previous 30 years, was invited to submit a formal inquiry to the Compact regarding membership or observer status. I had originally written, may apply. The legal team had revised it to, is invited. The difference mattered. May apply was permission. Is invited was welcome. When Osei finished reading, the channel was silent for 11 seconds. I counted them. Then Archon Vel spoke again, and his voice had changed in a way that I recognized immediately, because I had been watching Serenthi delegates for 19 years, and I understood what it meant when the careful smoothness left their speech, and something more pressured came through underneath. This is an act of war, he said. You have brought a military fleet into sovereign space and issued a unilateral declaration. This will be treated as an act of war. Osei's reply came without hesitation. We fired no shots, she said. We broke no treaties. Earth holds no treaties with the Council, having been expelled. We have not approached any station, vessel, or installation. We entered unclaimed outer orbital space and broadcast a legal document. If that constitutes an act of war under Council definitions, we suggest the Council review its definitions. Another silence. We will be departing this system in 6 hours, Osei continued. We will leave a single communications relay at this position. Any Council member species that wishes to make contact with the Compact delegation may use that relay. The channel will remain open. Then she went quiet. The display showed the 14 warships still in their clean horizontal line. The carrier platform still motionless. The Indomitable still dark at its edges, lit at its core, sitting in the outer dark of Selenarch Prime's system like something that had always intended to be there. I set down my tea. Gary, I said. Yes, Ambassador? Take us to the Indomitable, please. He looked at me in the rearview display. He looked at the display showing 14 warships and 2 carrier platforms, and the enormous, quietly lit flagship of the United Government Defense Fleet. "The Indomitable," he said. "That is the ship I just named, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular tone of someone who has just understood that they are living inside a moment that will be talked about for a very long time, "Ambassador, am I going to be in the history files?" I considered this. "You and your protein bar both," I said. He smiled. He entered the heading. The engines shifted from maintenance mode to full drive, and we turned toward the fleet, and toward whatever came next. I looked back once as we pulled away from the outer marker. Back at the distant lights of Selenarch Prime's orbital infrastructure, back at the council stations and the docked vessels of 14 species, and the great chamber where decisions had been made about humanity for 41 years. I thought about a small chair with a cushion on it. I still had the cushion under my arm. The corridor leading to Admiral Dara Osei's command office aboard the Indomitable was 42 meters long, and every meter of it was designed to inform you, without saying a single word, that you were inside something engineered for absolute purpose. There were no decorations. The walls were a clean, deep gray material that absorbed sound slightly, so that your footsteps landed quiet, and you became aware of the ship's own low operational hum filling the space instead. Overhead lighting was precise and even. Doors were sealed and labeled with the simple alphanumeric system that the UGDF had used since its founding. Section, deck, function. Nothing unnecessary. I had been aboard 3 other UGDF vessels in my career. None of them had felt like this. The others were patrol ships, support vessels, practical and functional, and slightly worn in the way things become when they work hard and receive just enough maintenance to keep working. The Indomitable was different, in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to miss. It felt new, which it was. It felt like something that had been built specifically for a specific kind of moment and had been waiting, in the careful way that serious things wait, for that moment to arrive. Gary Cole had docked us at the secondary bay with an efficiency that made me think he had been practicing this approach for some time, and had perhaps always hoped it would come to this. He had then been escorted with considerable courtesy to a crew lounge where someone had apparently arranged for him to receive both a hot meal and what the escort officer described as an appropriate briefing, which I took to mean that Gary was going to learn, over the next few hours, considerably more about the last 3 years of human space policy than he had previously known. I was taken directly to the command level. The officer who walked me through that 42-meter corridor was a young woman named Nina Hartley, rank of lieutenant, who moved with the quick precision of someone who had spent years on ships, and whose body had simply incorporated the rhythms of it. She said nothing during the walk, which I appreciated. I spent the walk doing what I always did when I entered a new environment. I noted everything, every door, every junction, every small detail of how this place was organized, and what that organization revealed about the people who had built it. Dara Osei was standing when I entered, not seated at her desk in the attitude of the busy superior granting an audience, standing at the large viewport on the far side of the office, looking out at the stars, in the attitude of someone who has just done something significant and is spending a moment with the reality of it. She was 53 years old. She was slightly shorter than I had expected from her recorded appearances, which is something I have noticed about many people whose reputations are large. They tend to be shorter in person, as if their physical self is quietly amused by how much space their ideas take up. She had the compact, economical build of someone who had maintained physical fitness not as a performance, but as a professional requirement, for so many years that it had become simply how she was built. Her face was still, watchful, and precise. She turned when I entered. We looked at each other for a moment, in the way that people look at each other, when they have been corresponding through encrypted military channels for 6 years, and are meeting, for all practical purposes, for the first time. "Ambassador Mori," she said. "Admiral Osei," I said. She gestured to the 2 chairs positioned near the viewport. We sat. Through the glass, I could see the faint sensor bloom of the Council's defense platforms, still active at their distance, still pointing in our direction without closing. "How did they take it?" she asked. "Vel called it an act of war." She nodded once, the way you nod when something happens exactly as predicted. "And the others?" The Duvari delegation went off-channel within 3 minutes of the broadcast ending. The Molthari representative left the main chamber shortly after, The Kell Syndicate's 4 representatives did not visibly react to anything, which with them means they are processing very rapidly. The ones we spoke to in private? No official response yet, but they will respond. I paused. Nina, the Duvari Trade Commissioner, sent me a personal message 40 minutes ago. It said only that he hoped we were well, and that he looked forward to speaking when we both had time. Osei considered this. 3 years ago, his first message to us said approximately the same thing. Yes, he has good instincts. We sat for a moment with the quiet between us. Outside, the stars did not care about any of this, which was, in its way, steadying. The relay? I asked. In position. Broadcasting. 3 incoming connections in the first 2 hours. I had not expected 3. I had estimated perhaps 1 in the first 24 hours. Which species? She told me. I will tell you what she told me. 2 of the 3 were species I had anticipated. The third was not. The third was a species that had been a founding council member for over 100 years. A species that everyone, including me, had assumed was secure in its council alignment. A species that had apparently been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for something that looked like a credible alternative. I sat with that information for a moment. The terms regarding the invitation clause, I said. The one about species that have experienced council pressure. Yes. How many qualify, technically? Osei looked at me steadily. We counted, across the past 30 years, using the council's own archived records. 27 species. She let that number settle before she continued. We did not put that number in the declaration. We decided it would read as inflammatory. It would have been accurate. Accuracy and inflammation are not mutually exclusive. The corner of her mouth moved in what was, for Dara Osei, approximately a smile. 27 species, most of them small. Several of them with resources the council values. All of them with institutional memory of having been treated in ways they did not appreciate. I thought about all of those species. I thought about all of those chairs. I wondered how many of them had cushions. What is the fleet's next move? I asked. We will hold this position for 6 hours as stated. Then we withdraw to the intermediate zone, outside council sovereign space, inside the corridor between council territory and the outer rim. We will remain there. She paused. Visibly. Visibly, I repeated. The council's defense coalition has, we have assessed, a response window of approximately 96 hours before their political cohesion begins to fragment. Their member species do not all agree on how to characterize what has happened. The ones who privately contacted us through the relay will not publicly advocate for a military response. The ones who might advocate for a military response will discover, when they examine the logistics, that a strike against our position in the intermediate zone would require passing through 3 trade corridors that their own economies depend on. I understood what she was saying. She was saying that the council's military option was effectively closed, not because they lacked ships, but because the geometry of it, the political, economic, physical geometry, made it something they could not execute without pulling a thread that would unravel things they valued more than the satisfaction of the action itself. Vel knows this, I said. He knew it when he called it an act of war, she agreed. That was not a military statement. That was a statement for his internal audience, for the other 8 species who voted with him, to maintain the appearance that there is a response available and that it will be exercised when the time is right. The time will never be right. No, it will not. A soft chime came from the panel near her desk. She glanced at it and then back at me. Another contact on the relay, she said. 4th species. I looked out the viewport. 27 species, across 30 years. All of them with memories. All of them, apparently, with the patience to wait for someone to do something first. The compact charter, I said. The membership process. How long does it take? Henry Adkins built it to be fast, she said. The retired judge from Cape Town had apparently made an impression on everyone who met him. Observer status can be granted in 72 hours. Full membership requires 90 days of review. He built it on the model of the old Earth trade agreements, the ones from the early trade century, before the unified government, when individual nations had to be able to respond quickly to opportunity. He understood what we were building. He said, when we finished the charter, that he hoped he lived to see what came of it. He is 81, Osei paused. We sent him a live feed of the broadcast. He watched from his home in Cape Town. I thought about Henry Adkins, 81 years old, watching from Cape Town, as a declaration he had helped write was read aloud by a military officer to an entire star system. I thought about my mother and her shipping logistics firm, my father and his secondary school mathematics. I thought about a lot of things in that moment that I am not going to write down because some things belong to the inside of a moment and not to the record of it. The council will send a formal diplomatic protest, I said, returning to business because business is what I am built for. They will argue the declaration has no legal standing under galactic law. Correct. We will argue that galactic law, as codified by the council, specifically reserves sovereign legal authority to each member species within its own territorial space, and that the declaration is an exercise of that reserved authority. Henry's argument, correct. And we will win that argument, because the council wrote the law that supports our position 30 years ago to protect their own member species from external interference. I paused. They wrote us a door and never noticed. That is also Henry's phrase. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in approximately 48 hours, and it felt like unclenching something that had been held tight for too long. Osei watched me with an expression that was not quite a smile but was something in the same neighborhood. The relay chimed again. 5th species. I pulled out my notes. Tell me about the 3 species that made contact in the first 2 hours, I said. Everything, starting with the one I did not anticipate. Osei told me. And we worked through the night, while the fleet held its position in the outer dark of Selenarch Prime's system, and the Council's defense platforms stayed active and pointing, and the relay accumulated contacts like a quiet, patient record of a world in the process of rearranging itself. I did not sleep. I did not need to. There are moments in a life when you are too far inside something important to feel tired, when the situation itself is generating the energy you would otherwise have had to produce yourself. I made tea. Osei, I discovered, drank coffee in quantities that suggested either a very efficient metabolism or a long-standing professional accommodation with reality. We worked. The 6th contact came from a species I had been quietly courting for 4 years. The 7th came at dawn, Nairobi time, which was the only clock I still kept set to Earth standard. By morning, we had a list. By the time the 6-hour window ended, and Osei gave the order to move the fleet to the intermediate zone, we had stopped counting contacts and started organizing them into categories. Inquiries, observer requests, 1 message, and I want to be precise here, 1 single message, that did not ask about membership or observer status but simply said, in the trade language that most species used for cross-cultural communication, "We are glad you are still here." I read that one twice. Then I filed it with everything else and kept working. I want to tell you about the 90 days that followed, but I am not going to tell you all of it, because most of it was the kind of work that matters enormously in the doing, and becomes very difficult to make interesting in the telling. There were meetings, there were legal arguments, there were 40-hour stretches where Osei and I, and a team of 17 people, worked through problems that had no precedent in galactic history, because no one had ever done this before, and we were making the precedent as we went. I will tell you the things that are worth telling. 11 species formally applied for compact membership in the first 30 days. Of those, 9 were approved through the expedited review process that Henry Adkins had designed. 2 required the full 90-day review, not because their applications were problematic, but because their situations were complicated. 1 involved a territorial overlap with a council border zone that required very careful legal mapping, and the other involved a species whose government had recently changed and whose new administration needed to be assessed for continuity of intent. The 2 species the council had likely expected to stay aligned, the Duvari and the Molthari, both submitted formal observer status inquiries within 2 weeks of the declaration. They did not immediately apply for membership, which I had anticipated. Both of them were making rational economic calculations. They were council members who had also been very large trading partners with Earth for 30 years. They were weighing what they stood to gain from compact alignment against what they stood to lose from council displeasure. I understood their position completely, and I respected the care they were bringing to it, and I made sure that every conversation we had with their representatives communicated, without pressure, that the door would remain open on our side for as long as it took. The Kell Syndicate sent a message exactly 32 days after the declaration. It was addressed to me personally rather than to the Compact delegation as a whole, and it said, in characteristically precise Kell language, that the Syndicate wished to schedule a series of consultations regarding the technical specifications of the Compact's trade licensing framework, as the Syndicate had concerns about several clauses that it felt might create inefficiencies in multi-party exchange arrangements. I recognized this for what it was. The Kell Syndicate did not complain about inefficiency in frameworks they had no intention of using. They were coming. They were just coming in the way the Kell always came to things, through the technical details, because the technical details were where they were most comfortable and where they felt most in control. I scheduled the consultations. The Council's formal diplomatic protest arrived on day 18. It was, as predicted, a lengthy document arguing that the declaration had no legal standing and that the Compact had been constituted in violation of Council interstellar governance protocols. Attached to it was a secondary document outlining the trade and travel restrictions that the Council intended to impose on human space as a punitive measure. We had expected both documents. We had, in fact, been looking forward to the second one, because the second one gave us the opportunity to demonstrate something that the Council had apparently not considered. The restrictions applied to Council member space. They restricted Council member ships from entering human-aligned routes, and Council member ports from processing human cargo. What they did not, could not, restrict was the 9 species that were now Compact members, who were no longer bound by Council trade protocols in their dealings with us. The Compact members represented, when you mapped their trade routes and resource production, approximately 31% of the Council's supply chain for 6 categories of goods that the inner Council species depended on for basic industrial function. When the restriction document was published, I sent a very polite note to each of the 9 Compact member species, informing them that the new Council restrictions did not apply to them, and that trade with human space would continue on the existing agreed terms. None of them changed their trade flows. The Council had imposed restrictions on themselves. On day 47, Archon Vel sent a personal communication. It came through an intermediary, a Serenthi trade liaison who I had known for 12 years, and who had the particular pained expression of someone required to deliver a message they have significant personal reservations about. The message asked whether the Compact would be willing to enter into dialogue regarding a possible reintegration framework through which Earth's relationship with the Council might be, and I am paraphrasing very slightly, restructured in a mutually beneficial manner. I read the message 3 times. I considered it for approximately 45 minutes. Which is how long I allow myself to enjoy something before I return to work. Then I drafted a reply. It was 3 sentences. It said that the Compact was always willing to engage in dialogue with any party regarding matters of mutual concern. It said that the Compact's position regarding its own legal standing, charter structure, and trade framework was not subject to revision as a precondition of such dialogue. It said that if Archon Vel wished to arrange a meeting, the Compact could offer a time and a location at his convenience. It was a polite reply. It was also, if you read it carefully, a reply that answered precisely nothing while appearing to answer everything, which is a technique I had spent 19 years perfecting in exactly that council chamber that had recently voted me out of it. The meeting was scheduled for day 89, one day before the 90-day formal review period ended. This timing was not accidental. Vel was a good enough diplomat to want to make the gesture before the review completed, so that it looked like engagement rather than concession. I let him have the timing. It cost nothing, and it gave him something to tell his internal audience. The location was the administrative center on Varath Station, a neutral installation about 4 light-years from Selenarch Prime that had been used for interspecies negotiations for 160 years. The Compact's legal team had suggested it. The Council's team had agreed without objection, which told me that they also recognized it as the appropriate venue for what this meeting actually was. I traveled to Varath Station on a UGD-DEF escort vessel, not a warship, but a fast diplomatic courier that had been newly commissioned and given the registration designation of a compact vessel, rather than a UGD-DEF vessel, which was a small detail that mattered more than its smallness suggested. I was met at the docking bay by Archon Vel's senior aide, a Serenthi official named Kress who was young by Serenthi standards. only about 60, and who had the manner of someone trying very hard to project a confidence they were not entirely feeling. Cress had been in that chamber when Vel cut off my speech. I remembered exactly where Cress had been sitting. I greeted Cress with complete warmth and no reference to any of that. We were taken to the negotiation suite, a large, well-appointed room with a central table designed to seat delegations from up to 6 species simultaneously. The council delegation was already present when we arrived. Vel himself, 2 advisors, and a legal representative. They stood when we entered, which was, under council protocol, the correct form for receiving a peer delegation, rather than a subordinate one. That was already different. I set my briefing materials on the table. On top of them, quite deliberately, I placed the cushion from the small chair. I did not explain it. I did not draw attention to it. I simply placed it there as I might place any item I had brought with me, and then I sat down, and the meeting began. Vel's eyes went to the cushion once, only once. I watched his skin cycle through 2 colors very quickly, and then settle. The Serenthi have a color I had spent years trying to classify, a particular greenish silver that their pigmentation produces under specific conditions. It is not listed in any of the standard diplomatic guides because it is rare enough that most observers do not encounter it. I had encountered it exactly twice before, both times in situations where a Serenthi individual had understood, with full clarity, that they were in a room with someone who was ahead of them. Vel produced that color for approximately 4 seconds. Then his skin returned to its diplomatic neutral tone, and the meeting proceeded. He did not call it an act of war this time. What followed was 6 hours of formal negotiation that I am going to compress here, not because it was unimportant. It was very important, but because the architecture of it is technical and specific, and what I want you to understand is the shape of it rather than every clause. The Council was proposing what they called a parallel membership framework, under which Earth could maintain the compact, while also re-engaging with the Council under revised terms. The revised terms would include full voting rights, a seat on the Inner Trade Committee, and formal recognition of the UGDF's operational independence. These were things that I had spent 19 years asking for. These were things that had been refused, delayed, deferred, and dismissed for 19 years. They were being offered now because the alternative, a compact that continued to grow, that was already at 11 members and accelerating, that had demonstrated it could operate economically without council infrastructure, was considerably worse for the council than the concessions they were putting on the table. I listened to every proposal. I asked questions. I did not agree to anything in that room. What I told Vel, at the end of 6 hours, was this: the Compact's governing council would review the council's proposals in full and provide a formal response within 30 days. Any response would be conditional on the lifting of the trade and travel restrictions the council had imposed, as the Compact could not conduct good faith dialogue while punitive measures remained active. Vel agreed to recommend the lifting of restrictions to the full council within the week. He agreed to it in under 30 seconds, which told me how prepared they already were to agree to it, and how long they had been prepared to agree to it, and how much of the last 90 days had been about internal council politics, rather than anything to do with us. I gathered my materials at the end of the meeting. I picked up the cushion. Vel watched me do this. "Ambassador," he said. I paused. "May I ask," he said, and his voice was careful in the way that pride makes things careful, "about the cushion?" I looked at him. I thought about a small chair at the back of a large room. I thought about 19 years of being present and invisible simultaneously. I thought about 7 words sent through an encrypted channel and 4 words received back, and about Gary Cole eating a protein bar in a shuttle at the edge of a star system while history arrived in a clean horizontal line. "It is from the chair I sat in for 19 years, I said, "in the council chamber." He was silent. "I brought it with me when I left," I said. "I thought it might be useful." I did not explain what I meant by useful. I did not need to. Archon Vel was a good diplomat, whatever else he was. He understood what I meant. I walked out of the negotiation suite, through the corridor, back to the docking bay, and onto the compact courier that was waiting for me. I sent a brief message to Dara Ose. Day 89, successful. Then I sent a longer message to a retired judge in Cape Town. I told Henry Adkins what had happened. I told him about the meeting, the proposals, the color of Vel's skin when he saw the cushion on the table. I told him what Vel had said, and what I had said back. I told him that we were not done, that we had 30 days to respond, that the Compact's governing council would meet and debate, and that there were members of that council who would argue for full independence, rather than any form of re-engagement with the council, and they would not be wrong to argue it, and the debate would be long and real and worth having. But I also told him that it had worked, that the architecture he had built had held its shape under pressure, that the door he had noticed, the one the council had built into their own law 30 years ago and never noticed themselves, had opened exactly the way he said it would. He replied within the hour. He was 81 years old and he typed very quickly for someone his age, which I had always found both impressive and charming. He said, "You know what that door was, don't you?" I said, "Tell me." He said, "They built it to keep people out, but doors work both ways. That is the first thing they teach you in property law. A lock keeps people in as much as it keeps people out." I read that twice. Then I put my notes away and I looked out the viewport of the courier at the dark between the stars, and I thought about the next 30 days, and the 30 after that, and everything that was going to have to be built and argued and negotiated and decided before any of this settled into the shape it was going to take. The Compact had 11 members. The relay was still accumulating contacts. Henry Adkins was still sending messages from Cape Town. Gary Cole was, last I heard, flying a new route, a compact designated corridor that had not existed 4 months ago, in a ship that had been commissioned specifically for compact service. He sent me a message when he flew it for the first time. It said, "Ambassador, I am in the history files." I checked. I told him to fly safely. He said he would. 6 months after the declaration, I stood in the Compact's first permanent assembly hall, and I watched 11 species settle into chairs that had been designed to fit all of them. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It had taken 4 months and considerable argument to get the chairs right. The Compact's first infrastructure team, 8 people, 3 species, one very strong opinion from a structural engineer named Paul Vega, who had emigrated from Melbourne and who took chair dimensions with a seriousness that I found both unusual and completely admirable, had spent weeks on it. The brief was simple and absolute. Every chair in the compact assembly hall would be sized correctly for the species sitting in it. Not approximately correct, not close enough, correctly. Paul Vega delivered on this. He delivered it 2 weeks late, and 30% over the materials budget, and without any apology for either, because Paul Vega was the kind of person who finished things the right way, and considered that sufficient justification for whatever it took to get there. I had never worked with anyone quite like him before. I intended to keep working with him for a very long time. The assembly hall itself was inside what had been, 3 months ago, an empty orbital platform in the neutral zone between Council space and the Outer Rim. The platform had been built as a commercial way station 30 years earlier by a consortium of species that had since dissolved, and it had been listed as an unclaimed asset in the Council's Outer Infrastructure Registry for 12 years. The Compact's legal team had purchased it through a perfectly standard acquisition process, renovated it according to specifications that Paul Vega had argued about with the construction team for 6 weeks, and renamed it Compact Station 1. Compact Station 1 was not beautiful. It was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be functional, durable, and large enough to grow into, which is perhaps not a traditional aesthetic goal but is, I have found, a more honest one than most. The assembly hall had seats for 28 species. 11 of them were occupied on the day I am describing to you. The remaining 17 were ready and waiting, which is a different kind of full from actually full, but is also its own kind of statement. I did not sit in a small chair. I sat in a chair that had been sized correctly, at a table that had been positioned in the center of the room rather than at its back, and when I looked across that table, I saw delegates from 11 species looking back at me, with the expression of people who had chosen to be somewhere rather than been assigned to it. That is a different expression. If you have ever been in both kinds of rooms, you know exactly what I mean. We were here to vote on the Council's proposals. I will not tell you that the debate was simple, because it was not. The Compact had 11 members, and they had 11 sets of interests, and 11 perspectives on the question of how to relate to the Council going forward. Several of them had been treated badly by the Council, in ways that were specific and recent, and that they had not forgotten. and several of them argued, with complete validity, that re-engagement was a form of forgiveness that had not been earned, and that the compact should simply continue building its own structure and let the council become irrelevant on its own schedule. I did not argue against those positions. They were not wrong. They were reasonable positions held by people with legitimate reasons for holding them. What I argued, and what the compact's legal and economic advisors argued, was that the two things were not mutually exclusive. We could engage with the council's proposals and continue building the compact. We could negotiate from strength rather than from need, which was the only kind of negotiation I had any interest in conducting, and which was a fundamentally different exercise from anything I had done in 19 years of council membership. The discussion ran for 7 hours across 2 days. At the end of it, the compact voted. 9 in favor of conditional engagement, 2 abstaining, 0 opposed. The 2 abstaining species, and I want to be clear that I respected their positions entirely, were the ones who had experienced the most significant council pressure in the previous decade. They were not willing to vote against engagement, but they were not willing to vote for it. I understood this. I told their delegates, privately, that I understood it, and that their voice in the compact was as full and real whether they voted or abstained, and that the process was long, and we were only at the beginning of it. They both, separately, thanked me for saying that. Then we transmitted the compact's conditional response to the council, and we went back to work. I am going to tell you something now that is not in the formal records of any of this, not in the assembly minutes or the diplomatic correspondence or the legal filings that will eventually be organized into archives and studied by people who are currently very young. I went back to the small chair. Not literally. The council chamber chair is, as far as I know, still in its position at the back of the hall on Selenarch Prime, bolted to the floor because no one ever bothered to change it. I am not going to Selenarch Prime anytime soon, for reasons that are both practical and personal. But I went back to it in the way you go back to things. In the quiet of a moment when no one is asking you for anything. In the space between what has happened and what comes next. I sat with the memory of it the way you sit with any experience that shaped you. The way you hold something up against the light to see what it is actually made of. The small chair had been meant to diminish. That was its entire purpose. To communicate, through the straightforward language of physical arrangement, that whoever sat in it was peripheral, not central, not important enough to merit a correctly sized seat. It had done the opposite. Because the thing about being placed at the margins for a very long time is that from the margins you can see everything. You can see how the room actually works, not how it presents itself. You can see who talks to whom before sessions begin, and what those conversations change about the outcomes. You can see which alliances are genuine, and which are performances for the chamber record. You can see the load-bearing structures of a system, because you are not inside them, and when you are not inside something, you can also see how it could be built differently. I had sat in that small chair for 19 years. I had seen everything. The fleet, the declaration, the compact, the relay filling with contacts. None of it had happened suddenly. None of it was a response to the expulsion vote. The expulsion vote was the council making a move in a game that had already been decided 3 decades earlier, by the same practical intelligence that my parents had applied to shipping logistics and secondary school mathematics, applied by me, and by Dara Osei, and by Henry Adkins, and by Gary Cole, and by Paul Vega, and his precisely sized chairs, and by every person who had spent years working quietly on something that they fully intended to use. Archon Vel had looked at humanity and seen a problem to be managed. He had spent 41 years managing it. He had done a reasonable job, from his perspective. What he had not understood, what the council had not understood, in any of its 41 years of managing us, was that we were not trying to fit into their structure. We were studying it, learning its geometry, identifying where it was strong and where it was brittle, and what would happen if someone chose to stop asking for a seat at the table and simply built one of their own. We had been patient. We had been quiet. We had sat in a small chair with a cushion on it, and we had watched and learned and prepared and waited for the moment when the council's own action gave us the standing to respond. They handed us that standing themselves, on a Wednesday morning, with a vote of 9-1. We were grateful. Compact Station 1 completed its first full week of operations with 4 new observer inquiries logged, 2 bilateral trade agreements signed, and one very satisfying communication from the Council's Inner Trade Committee, requesting a clarification on the Compact's trade licensing framework for a category of goods that the committee had previously administered without human input. I wrote the clarification myself. It was clear and precise, and written in the kind of language that says we know exactly what we are doing, and we are happy to explain it to you. The Duvari Trade Commissioner, Nina Sorensen, came to Compact Station 1 personally on day 112. She came, officially, to discuss observer status. She came, unofficially, and she said this to me over dinner on the second evening, with the directness that I had always appreciated about the Duvari, because she wanted to see for herself what we had built. She walked the station for a full day before our formal meeting. She inspected the assembly hall. She counted the chairs, which I would have found amusing in anyone else, but which, coming from Nina, I recognized as genuine assessment. She spoke with delegates from 3 of the Compact's member species at length. When we sat down for dinner, she said, "You built this fast." I said, "We built it over 30 years. We installed it fast." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I wrote down that evening, because I wanted to remember it. She said, "We knew you were different. We just thought different meant dangerous. We were wrong about which kind of different you were." I thought about that for a long time after she left. Different meant dangerous. That was the assumption that had underlain 41 years of council management. That was the architecture of the small chair, the 4-minute speech limit, the 72-hour grace period, with its implication that humanity would comply, because humanity had always complied, because what else could we do? They had not been wrong that we were different. They had simply catastrophically misidentified what our particular kind of different was capable of producing. We were not dangerous in the way they feared. We were patient in a way they had not accounted for. We were builders. We were planners. We were, perhaps above all else, the kind of people who look at a chair that is too small and do not leave the room. We sit down, we put a cushion on it, we take very careful notes, and we wait. The waiting ends when it ends, not before. The Compact's first year ended with 16 full members, 21 observer species, and an economic partnership network that handled an estimated 44% of Outer Rim resource trade, independently of council infrastructure. Henry Adkins came to the station for the first-year ceremony. We flew him out on a compact courier, the same model Gary Cole flew, and he spent the trip writing notes about clause improvements for the membership charter, which told you everything you needed to know about Henry Adkins. He walked into the assembly hall, and he stood in the center of it, and he looked at the chairs, all of them, every correctly sized, deliberately proportioned chair in that room. He said, "How is the small one?" I said, "In the bag in my office. It still has the cushion." He laughed. He had a very good laugh for a man of 81. I asked him what he intended to do with all those charter notes he had been writing on the flight out. He said he intended to give them to me and then have an extremely large dinner and look at the stars from the viewport in his room and feel, if I did not mind him saying so, very satisfied. I told him I did not mind him saying so. Then I went back to work. That is what we are. When the moment has passed and the declaration has been read, and the fleet has held its position and the votes have been counted, and the chairs have been correctly sized, we go back to work. We are not a species that mistakes the victory for the destination. We are a species that understands a victory is the point from which you begin the next thing. The council is still there. It is smaller than it was, in influence and in economic reach, and it is aware of this, and it is adapting, because old structures do not disappear overnight. They change. Sometimes they change toward something better. Archon Vel retired 8 months after the declaration. His replacement is a younger Serenthi official who has, in the first communications I have had with her, been considerably more practical and considerably less interested in performing authority than in actually using it. I am cautiously optimistic. I still have the cushion. I keep it in the bag in my office, as I told Henry, and sometimes I take it out and I sit with it for a moment, the way you sit with any object that has been through something with you, that carries the weight of time simply by existing. It is not a trophy. I want to be precise about this. I do not keep it to celebrate what happened. I keep it to remember what it felt like to sit in that small chair, the patience of it, the quiet refusal to leave, The long understanding that the correct response to being underestimated is not to prove yourself immediately, but to let the underestimation run until it becomes a mistake the other party makes entirely on their own. They handed us everything we needed. We just made sure we were ready to use it when they did. Above the entrance to Compact Station 1's assembly hall, carved into the structural panel in 12 languages including the 3 oldest written forms of human script that our cultural historians had insisted on including, is the sentence that I suggested, and that the Governing Council ratified unanimously on the station's first day of operation. It is simple. It was always going to be simple. The things that are true are usually simple, once you have found your way to them through all the complexity. It says, "We do not ask, we declare." I walk under it every morning. I do not look up at it every time. I do not need to. It is enough to know it is there, the way it is enough to know that Gary Cole is somewhere on a compact route in his correctly registered courier, and Henry Adkins is in Cape Town making notes on charter clauses he will send me by the weekend, and Dara Osei is on the Indomitable in the intermediate zone, running dark at the edges and lit at the core, waiting in the way that serious things wait. We are not finished. We have barely started. But we are here, and we are staying, and we built the table ourselves. That, in the end, is the only thing that ever mattered.